The candles in the ballroom had barely finished flickering when the whisper reached Cordelia Ashworth's ears, and by the time she understood what was being said about her, it was already too late to stop it. She left his house alone, at night, unaccompanied. A woman murmured behind a painted fan, not troubling to lower her voice enough. No maid, no carriage of her own, just walked out of the Duke of Jedburgh's townhouse as if she owned the street. Cordelia froze mid-step, her gloved hand still resting on her brother's arm. The music continued, the dancers continued, but every face near her had turned, slowly, deliberately, the way a flock of birds turns before it scatters. She had gone to Alistair Vane's house 3 nights ago for one reason only. She had overheard, quite by accident, a conversation in her uncle's study about a plot against the Duke's life, something involving forged papers and a man named Hartley who worked in the Duke's own stables. She had not been able to sleep, knowing what she knew, and so she had done the only thing that made sense to her frightened 18-year-old mind. She had gone to warn him herself, alone, because there had been no time to arrange a chaperone, no time to explain herself to anyone who might have stopped her. She had stayed 11 minutes. She had delivered her warning. She had left. 11 minutes had become, in the mouths of London's finest gossips, an entire scandal. She had known, even as she slipped out through the servants' entrance that night, that what she was doing carried risk. Young women did not call upon unmarried dukes after dark, not without a chaperone, not without an invitation, not for any reason at all if they hoped to keep their good name intact. But the danger she had overheard felt so immediate, so real, that propriety had seemed like a small price to pay for a man's life. She had told herself no one would ever know. She had been wrong about that most of all. Now, standing in the middle of a ballroom she had entered only an hour ago as a respected young woman, she felt the full weight of her miscalculations settle over her like a physical thing. The Countess of Marrow, a woman famous for the speed with which she carried news from one drawing room to the next, was already deep in conversation with 3 other ladies near the refreshment table, her eyes flicking toward Cordelia every few seconds with poorly disguised delight. Whatever kindness Cordelia had intended that night in Alistair's study meant nothing to a room that had already decided what story it preferred to tell. Cordelia, her brother Edwin's voice was tight with panic, his fingers pressing hard enough into her arm to bruise. "We are leaving now. Edwin, I only went to. I do not care what you went to do." He was already steering her toward the doors, his smile fixed and brittle for the benefit of anyone still watching. "You will explain it to Mother, not to me, not here." The carriage ride home was silent except for the sound of her own heartbeat, which felt loud enough to fill the small space entirely. Cordelia stared out the window at the passing lamplight and tried to understand how a single act of courage had transformed, overnight, into something that made her own brother unable to look at her. Her mother was waiting in the drawing room when they arrived, still dressed for the evening she had not attended, her face pale and drawn in the candlelight. "Tell me it is not true," her mother said the moment the door closed. "It is not what they are saying," Cordelia answered. "I went to warn him of danger, that is all. I have done nothing to be ashamed of. Whether you have done anything is no longer the question that matters." Her mother's voice cracked, just slightly, on the word matters. "The question is, what people believe you have done, and by morning, all of London will believe the worst of it." Cordelia opened her mouth to argue, but there was nothing left to say. Her mother was not wrong. She had lived in this world long enough to know that truth carried very little weight against a well-told rumor, especially when the rumor involved a duke, a young unmarried woman, and the scandalous hour of midnight. "I only wish to help him," Cordelia said at last, her voice smaller than she intended. "Is that truly such a terrible thing?" Her mother crossed the room and took her by the shoulders, and for a moment her expression softened into something closer to grief than anger. "It is not terrible, my dear. It is simply not how this world works. Kindness is not rewarded here. Only appearances are, and your appearance, as of tonight, is ruined beyond anything I can repair with an apology or a denial." She released her, stepping back, and the softness vanished again beneath practical resolve. "So we will not try to repair it. We will remove you from it instead, until it forgets you exist." By dawn, the decision had already been made without her. She was to leave London within the week, sent to a small estate in Yorkshire belonging to a distant cousin of her mother's, a woman named Beatrice Holt who kept sheep and bees and had not set foot in a ballroom in over 20 years. There, Cordelia was to remain until the scandal faded from memory, until some fresher piece of gossip replaced her name in the mouths of the city's idle tongues. There, she was meant to forget the Duke of Jedburgh entirely, as though 11 minutes in his study could be undone simply by distance. She packed her trunks herself, refusing the help of the maid her mother sent, needing something to do with her hands that was not crying. Each dress she folded felt like a small piece of the life she was leaving behind, a life that, only 2 days ago, had included invitations to 3 separate garden parties and a standing arrangement to take tea with her closest friend every Thursday afternoon. Now those invitations would quietly disappear, withdrawn without explanation, and her friend, she suspected, would find a polite reason to stop calling altogether. Scandal did not simply attach itself to the person at its center. It spread outward, and no one wished to be caught standing too close when it did. Her father, a quiet man who rarely involved himself in the household's social affairs, came to her room only once that final week, and said very little. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her fold a gray traveling dress into her trunk, and then he said only, "I know you did not mean harm, Cordelia. I have always known that of you." It was not an apology for sending her away, and it was not a promise to stop it, but it was more comfort than she had received from anyone else in the house, and she held on to it the way one holds on to a single warm coal on a cold night. It was on the final evening, the night before her departure, that she saw him again. She had gone out onto the small back terrace of her family's townhouse for air, unable to bear another moment inside walls that had suddenly turned against her, and she found him standing there already, as though he had been waiting. Alistair Vane, Duke of Jedburgh, looked nothing like the calm, composed man she had warned 3 nights before. His jaw was tight, his eyes shadowed, and there was something in the way he stood, very still, very controlled, that told her he was holding back a great deal of anger, though whether at her or at the situation itself she could not tell. "You should not be here," she said quietly. "If anyone sees you, it will only make things worse. Things are already as bad as they can reasonably be made," he answered. "I came to tell you that I know what has happened, and I know it is not fair, and I intend to find out who is responsible for turning your kindness into a weapon against you. It hardly matters now who is responsible." She wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill, though the cold she felt had little to do with the weather. "I am being sent away regardless, tomorrow, to Yorkshire." Something shifted in his expression, quick and sharp, gone almost before she could name it. "Yorkshire. My mother believes distance will help me forget this ever happened. Forget you, specifically, since apparently you are the cause of my ruin, though you did nothing but exist in a house I chose to enter. You entered that house to save my life." A fact that seems to interest no one but us. She let out a short, humorless breath. "Everyone else only cares that I entered it at all." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could see, clearly, the exhaustion beneath his composure. "I will not let this rest, Cordelia. Whoever started this rumor did not do it by accident. Rumors like this do not simply appear from nowhere, not with such precise timing, not the very night after you came to me with a warning about a plot against my life. I intend to find out who benefits from your ruin and my distraction, and when I do, I will make certain the truth is known. And in the meantime, I am sent to the country like a disgraced child." "In the meantime," he said, "you survive it, and I will not forget where you have gone." She wanted to ask him what that meant, whether it was a promise or simply a courtesy, but her mother's voice called from inside the house, sharp with worry, and the moment closed as quickly as it had opened. By the time she turned back, he had already stepped into the shadows of the garden wall, gone as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving her with nothing but his words and the cold night air. The next morning, she left London before the sun had fully risen, the city's rooftops fading behind her in a gray haze as the carriage carried her north. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not give her family, or the gossiping city she left behind, the satisfaction of her tears. But as the hours passed and the familiar streets gave way to open fields and low stone walls, she found herself thinking not of the scandal, not of her ruined reputation, not even of her frightened family, but of the Duke's final words to her on that terrace. "I will not forget where you have gone." She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not follow disgraced young women into the countryside over a debt of gratitude. He had his own life to protect, his own investigation to pursue, his own world to return to once the scandal cooled. And yet, as the carriage rattled over the northern roads, carrying her further from everything she had ever known, she could not quite make herself believe that she had seen the last of Alistair Vane. She was right not to believe it. But she would not understand exactly how right for several more days, when a stranger would arrive in the quiet village near her cousin's estate, asking careful, deliberate questions about the roads, the local families, and the exact location of Beatrice Holt's house, in a voice that the village blacksmith would later describe, with some confusion, as entirely too refined for a man claiming to be a simple land surveyor. The village of Thornfield Hollow smelled of rain and wood smoke, and it took Cordelia less than a day to realize that nothing about her old life would be of any use to her here. Her cousin Beatrice Holt met her at the gate of a low stone house surrounded by sheep pastures, wearing a coat that had clearly been mended more than once, and boots caked with mud to the ankle. She was nothing like the elegant, gossiping women of London society. Her hands were rough from years of working her own land, and her eyes, when they studied Cordelia's fine traveling dress, held no judgment at all, only a kind of amused practicality. "You'll ruin that dress within a week if you insist on wearing it around here," Beatrice said by way of greeting. "Better to have Marjorie cut you something plainer. Come inside. You look like you haven't slept." Cordelia had not slept, not properly, not since the night of the ball. But there was something steadying about Beatrice's brisk manner, the complete absence of pity in her voice, that made the enormous distance between her old life and this new one feel, for the first time, almost bearable. The house itself was small but warm, filled with the smell of baking bread and drying herbs hung from the low ceiling beams. Marjorie, the housekeeper, was a stout woman with a sharp tongue and sharper eyes, who took one look at Cordelia's trunks and declared that half of what was inside them would be useless within a fortnight. "City clothes," Marjorie said, shaking her head as she unpacked the first trunk. "Pretty things for pretty rooms. You'll want wool and sturdy boots out here, my lady, not silk that tears the first time you walk through a hedge." "I am not accustomed to walking through hedges," Cordelia admitted. "Well," Marjorie's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You'll learn quick enough, or you'll spend the whole season indoors feeling sorry for yourself, and I don't imagine that's why your family sent you all this way." The words stung, but they were not unkind, and Cordelia found she did not mind them the way she might have minded a similar comment from a London acquaintance. There was no cruelty behind it, only plain truth, delivered the way one might comment on the weather. Over the following days, Cordelia began, slowly and without quite meaning to, building a routine for herself. She rose early, before the sun had fully cleared the hills, and helped Beatrice with small tasks around the house, tasks she had never once performed in London, where servants handled every practical matter of daily life. She learned to gather eggs from the henhouse without being pecked. She learned which herbs Marjorie preferred for the kitchen, and which were kept only for medicine. She learned the names of the village families who came by with news or trade, the miller's wife who always brought extra flour, the blacksmith's son who was sweet on a girl 3 farms over, the old widow who kept bees and swore honey cured everything from a sore throat to a broken heart. It was a smaller world than the one she had left, but it was, she began to realize, a world entirely her own, untouched by whispers and painted fans, and the particular cruelty of a ballroom turning against her all at once. On her 5th morning at Thornfield Hollow, Beatrice took her along on the weekly trip into the village proper, a cluster of low stone buildings gathered around a small square with a well at its center. Cordelia had expected to feel like an outsider, a curiosity dropped into a world that had no place for her, but the villagers greeted Beatrice with easy familiarity, and extended the same warmth to Cordelia without hesitation, asking after her journey, and offering advice on which shopkeeper sold the freshest bread. "They don't care where you've come from," Beatrice said quietly, noticing Cordelia's surprise. "Out here, people care whether you're kind to their children and honest in your dealings. That's the whole of it. London could learn a great deal from a village that judges a person by their actions instead of their name." Cordelia thought of the Countess of Marrow's painted fan, and the way the entire ballroom had turned to stare, and found she could not disagree. Still, even as the days passed and her routine grew more familiar, a small unease had begun to settle in her, one she could not entirely name. Twice now, while walking to the market with Marjorie, she had noticed a man she did not recognize standing near the edge of the square, watching the road rather than attending to any obvious business of his own. He wore the plain clothes of a traveler, nothing that should have drawn attention, and yet something in the way he lingered, never quite approaching, never quite leaving, made the hair on her arms rise each time she caught sight of him. "Do you know that man?" she asked Marjorie the second time, nodding subtly toward the stranger. Marjorie squinted across the square. "Can't say I do. Travelers pass through often enough, on their way to the northern roads. No cause for concern, I'd wager. Though I'll ask the blacksmith if he's taken a room anywhere nearby." Cordelia told herself Marjorie was right, that there was no reason a stranger's presence should unsettle her so deeply. And yet the feeling lingered, quiet and persistent, long after the man had disappeared from the square each time, like a shadow she could not quite shake from the corner of her eye. Still, some nights, When the house had gone quiet and Beatrice and Marjorie had retired to their rooms, Cordelia would sit by the small window in her bedroom and think of the terrace, and the cold night air, and the way Alistair Vane had looked at her before she left. "I will not forget where you have gone." She turned the words over in her mind so many times they began to feel worn smooth, like a stone carried too long in a pocket. She told herself, each time, that it meant nothing. He was a duke with responsibilities she could not begin to imagine, an investigation to pursue, a life in London that had nothing to do with a disgraced young woman sent away to tend sheep in Yorkshire. She told herself this, and yet some small, stubborn part of her continued to watch the road that led into the village each time she walked to market, as though she expected, somehow, to see him there. She did not know, could not have known, what Alistair himself was doing in the days after her departure. He had returned to his townhouse the morning after she left London and immediately summoned his most trusted man, a former soldier named Nathaniel Corbin who had served under him years before, and now managed the quieter, more delicate matters of the Duke's household. Corbin was not a man given to unnecessary questions, which was precisely why Alistair trusted him. "I want to know who started the rumor about Lady Ashworth," Alistair said, standing at the window of his study, the very room Cordelia had entered 3 nights before. "Not the gossip itself. I care nothing for that. I want to know who first spoke the words, and to whom, and why it happened the very night after she came to warn me of danger against my own life." Corbin considered this for a long moment. "You believe the two events are connected. I believe it is a remarkable coincidence otherwise. Someone knew she had come here. Someone chose that particular night to plant the rumor, knowing precisely how it would spread, and precisely how much damage it would do to a young, unmarried woman's reputation. That is not the work of idle gossip. That is the work of someone who wanted her removed, and me distracted, at the same time." It took Corbin the better part of a week to trace the rumor to its source, moving carefully through the servants' quarters of 6 great houses, buying discretion with coin where necessary and calling in old debts where it was not. What he uncovered troubled Alistair more than he had expected. The rumor had first been spoken not by a gossiping lady's maid, as such things usually began, but by a footman in the employ of Lord Edmund Carow, a distant cousin of Alistair's who stood to inherit a significant portion of the Jedburgh estate, should anything happen to Alistair before he married, and produced an heir of his own. Carow had never made any secret of his resentment toward his more fortunate cousin, though he had always kept that resentment carefully hidden behind polite smiles and easy conversation at family gatherings. Carow. Alistair repeated the name slowly, feeling the pieces settle into place with an unpleasant clarity. "He knew about the threat to my life. He must have. And rather than warn me himself, or expose whoever planned it, he used the knowledge to ruin the one person who did warn me, ensuring I would be too consumed with the scandal, and with grief over the damage done to an innocent woman, to notice whatever he intended to do next." "It is possible he is behind the original threat as well," Corbin said carefully. "The forged papers, the man in your stables. It would explain how he knew of the danger before it was ever made public." "Hartley," Alistair said, recalling the name Cordelia had overheard that night, the stable hand implicated in the plot against him. "Has he been questioned?" "He disappeared the same night the rumor began to spread, sir. No one has seen him since. Either he fled out of fear of being caught, or someone paid him well enough to vanish before he could be questioned at all." Alistair's jaw tightened. A missing witness, a convenient scandal, a cousin with everything to gain from his death and nothing to lose by ruining an innocent woman in the process. The shape of it was becoming clearer with every piece Corbin uncovered, and none of it left him any room for comfort. "Then we must assume Carow is both patient and thorough. A man who plans this carefully will not simply abandon his scheme because his first attempt failed to end my life. He will wait, and watch, and try again when he believes no one is looking closely enough to stop him. And Lady Ashworth remains a loose thread in that scheme," Corbin said quietly. "She knows what she overheard. If Carow believes she might yet repeat it to someone who could act on it, or if he simply wishes to ensure her silence permanently, she may be in more danger in that quiet village than she would ever be here in London, surrounded by people who might notice if something happened to her." The thought settled over Alistair like a weight pressing against his chest, sharper and more urgent than anything he had felt since the night she left. He had told himself, standing on that terrace, that he intended only to protect her from a distance, to ensure her safety without disturbing the quiet life she was attempting to rebuild. But Corbin's words made plain what he had perhaps already understood without allowing himself to admit it. Distance would not be enough, not if Carow's ambition ran as deep and as ruthless as the evidence now suggested. Alistair said nothing for a long moment, staring out at the grey London morning, thinking not of Caro's ambition, which he could have predicted, but of Cordelia, alone in a country house in Yorkshire, believing herself sent away for nothing more than an unfortunate accident of timing, when in truth she had been the deliberate, calculated casualty of a much larger scheme. "Yorkshire," he said finally. "Sir? Lady Ashworth has been sent to a village called Thornfield Hollow, staying with a cousin of her mother's. If Caro is willing to destroy an innocent woman's reputation to protect his own interests, I do not believe he will simply stop there, not while she remains a witness to whatever else he may be planning. I want a man watching that village, quietly, and I want to know immediately if anyone unfamiliar arrives asking questions about her." Corbin nodded, already moving toward the door, but paused before leaving. "And you, sir, what will you do?" Alistair was quiet for a moment, considering the question more seriously than Corbin likely intended it. "I have business in the north," he said at last. "Land matters, concerning a property near the Yorkshire border. I believe it is time I attended to it personally." It was, of course, a lie, or at the very least a convenient stretching of the truth, but it was the only answer he intended to give, even to a man he trusted as much as Corbin. Some things, he had decided, were his to protect quietly, without explanation, until he understood the full shape of the danger closing in around a woman who had risked everything for a stranger's life, and asked for nothing in return. The stranger arrived in Thornfield Hollow on a grey Tuesday morning, and Cordelia knew, the very moment she saw him standing outside the village inn, that her quiet exile had just come to an end. He was dressed differently than he had been on the terrace that final night in London, wearing the plain, sturdy clothes of a gentleman traveling on business, rather than the fine coat of a duke attending a ball, and his dark hair was slightly windblown from the journey. But there was no mistaking the set of his shoulders, or the sharp, watchful way his eyes moved across the square before finding her. Alistair Vane. Cordelia stopped so suddenly that Marjorie, walking beside her with a basket of eggs, nearly collided with her back. "My lady, whatever is the—" Marjorie followed her gaze and fell silent, taking in the stranger's expensive boots and the careful way he carried himself despite his plain clothing. "Well, that's not a man from around here." "No," Cordelia said quietly, "he is not." She considered, for one brief and cowardly moment, turning and walking in the opposite direction, pretending she had not seen him at all. But he was already crossing the square toward her, and there was nowhere in a village this small to hide from a duke determined to find her. "Lady Ashworth." His voice, when he reached her, was carefully measured, pitched for her ears alone rather than the curious villagers who had already begun to notice the stranger's interest in the newcomer at Beatrice Holt's house. "I find myself in need of directions. I understand there is a property nearby I have some business concerning." It was, she recognized immediately, a performance for the benefit of anyone listening, and a rather thin one. "Business," she repeated flatly. "In Thornfield Hollow. How remarkable, given that you have never once mentioned owning land anywhere near Yorkshire." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close to one. "The estate is newly acquired, rather sudden circumstances. How convenient." "Isn't it?" he agreed, and for a moment, despite everything, despite the anger she still carried at being sent away, despite the danger she now suspected had followed him north, she felt something loosen in her chest at the sight of a familiar face in this unfamiliar world. Marjorie, sensing correctly that this conversation required privacy she was not meant to overhear, made a polite excuse about needing to speak with the miller's wife, and hurried off across the square, though not without a curious glance back over her shoulder. "Why are you here?" Cordelia asked once they were alone, her voice dropping the pretense entirely. "And do not speak to me of land, your grace. I may have been sent away from London, but I have not lost my ability to recognize a lie." Alistair's expression sobered instantly, the careful performance falling away. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "There is a great deal I need to tell you, and I would rather not do it standing in the middle of a village square." They walked together along the edge of the square and onto a quiet lane bordered by low stone walls, the kind of path Cordelia had come to know well over her days at Thornfield Hollow, though it felt strange, almost dreamlike, to be walking it now beside the very man she had spent so many quiet evenings thinking of. "My man Corbin traced the rumor to its source," Alistair said once they were safely away from curious ears. "It did not begin as idle gossip, Cordelia. It began with a footman in the employ of my cousin, Edmund Caro." Cordelia stopped walking. "Your cousin?" "He stands to inherit a significant portion of my estate should I die without an heir. He has always resented that inheritance is not already his, outright. though he has hidden that resentment well enough that I never suspected him of anything worse than petty jealousy. Alistair's jaw tightened. Corbin believes Caro may also be behind the original threat against my life. The very plot you overheard and came to warn me of. The stable hand implicated in it disappeared the same night your reputation was destroyed, either out of fear, or because someone paid him handsomely to vanish before he could be questioned. The full weight of what he was telling her settled over Cordelia slowly, each piece falling into place with a clarity that made her stomach turn cold. He ruined me to protect himself, and to distract you. That is my belief, yes. And now you have come here, to a quiet village where I was meant to disappear from London's memory entirely, to tell me that the man responsible for my ruin may also wish me silenced, because I am the only person outside his own scheme who knows what was originally planned. Her voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, the way it always did when she was working hard not to let fear show through. Is that the whole of it, Your Grace, or is there more danger you have yet to mention? There is one more thing. Alistair's expression was grim. For the past several days before I arrived, a man has been seen near this village asking questions. Quiet questions, careful ones, about a young woman recently arrived from London, staying with relations nearby. I believe he has been watching you, Cordelia, waiting to determine whether you pose enough of a risk to warrant more direct action. Cordelia thought immediately of the stranger she had noticed near the market square, the man who lingered at the edges of the crowd, watching the road rather than attending to any business of his own. I have seen him, she said, twice. I told myself it meant nothing. It means everything. Alistair's voice was low and urgent now, all pretense of casual land business entirely abandoned. I should never have allowed you to come here alone, believing yourself safe simply because you were far from London. Caro's reach is longer than I gave him credit for, and I will not make that mistake again. You did not send me here, Alistair. My own family did that. Believing distance alone would erase a scandal that was never truly about scandal at all. She said his given name without thinking, the familiarity slipping out before she could stop it, and something in his expression shifted at the sound of it, softening despite the grim conversation between them. What do you propose we do now? I cannot simply return to London. My family would never permit it, not with the scandal still fresh in every drawing room. You need not return to London. Alistair's voice was steady now, resolved. But you cannot remain unprotected either, not while Caro's man continues to watch this village. I have already arranged for the estate I mentioned, the one I claim to have business concerning, to be entirely real, purchased some years ago and largely unused since. It sits less than 2 miles from here. I intend to remain in the area, quietly, until we understand the full extent of the danger and can put an end to it properly. And what am I meant to do in the meantime? Continue gathering eggs and pretending I have not noticed a stranger watching my every movement? A ghost of a smile crossed his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. I would ask that you continue exactly as you have been, yes, but with certain precautions. Corbin will position men to watch the village discreetly, without drawing attention. I ask only that you send word to me immediately, through Beatrice's housekeeper if necessary, should you notice anything unusual, anyone unfamiliar, any change in the pattern of your days that troubles you. Cordelia studied him for a long moment, taking in the tired lines around his eyes, the careful, controlled way he held himself despite what she now understood to be genuine fear on her behalf. You came all this way yourself. You could have sent Corbin, or another man in your employ to watch over me from a distance. Why did you come in person, Your Grace, at considerable risk to your own reputation and safety? The question hung between them in the quiet lane, and for a long moment, Alistair did not answer, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch despite herself. Because you risked everything to warn me of danger, expecting nothing in return, and received only ruin for your trouble, he said finally, his voice low. I could not, in good conscience, remain in London, attending to my own comfort, while you faced a threat I helped create, however unintentionally. And if I am entirely honest with you, Cordelia, my reasons are not so simple as duty alone. She did not ask him to explain further. She was not certain, in that moment, that she wanted him to, not while so much danger still hung over both their heads, waiting to be resolved before anything else between them could be allowed to matter. You should return to the village before Marjorie grows suspicious of how long we have been walking alone together, she said instead, though her voice lacked any real conviction behind the words. Yes, he agreed, though he made no immediate move to leave. I should. Neither of them moved for a long moment, the quiet lane stretching around them, empty, except for the distant sound of sheep in a nearby field, and the soft rustle of wind through the hedgerows. It was Cordelia, finally, who broke the silence, stepping back with visible effort. "I will send word if I notice anything," she said. "And you will do the same, should Corbin learn more of Caro's intentions. You have my word." She turned to walk back toward the village, but paused after only a few steps, glancing back at him over her shoulder. "Alistair." He looked up, something hopeful flickering briefly across his tired features. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not forgetting where I had gone." She did not wait to see his response before continuing back toward the square, her heart beating faster than the short walk should have warranted. And it was only later that evening, lying awake in her small room at Beatrice's house, that she allowed herself to fully feel the fear his news had stirred in her, alongside something else entirely, something warmer and far more dangerous to her already fragile peace of mind. 3 days passed in careful, watchful quiet. Cordelia continued her routine exactly as before, gathering eggs, walking to market, helping Marjorie with the household's daily tasks, all while remaining acutely aware of every stranger's face, every unfamiliar shadow near the edges of the village square. She saw no further sign of the man who had watched her before, and she told herself this was reassurance rather than a deeper, more unsettling silence, the kind that so often preceded a storm rather than announced its absence entirely. It was on the 4th evening, as she was returning alone from the widow's cottage at the edge of the village, having gone to collect a jar of honey Marjorie had requested, that she first understood how wrong that reassurance had been. The lane back to Beatrice's house cut through a narrow stretch of woodland, quiet and shadowed even in daylight, and Cordelia had walked it a dozen times without incident, but as the evening light faded around her, she became aware, slowly and with a growing sense of dread, that she was not alone on the path. Footsteps, careful and deliberate, moved through the trees somewhere behind her, matching her pace exactly whenever she walked, falling silent whenever she paused to listen. She did not run. Running, she knew instinctively, would only confirm to whoever followed her that she had noticed them, and confirm, too, that she was afraid. Instead, she quickened her pace only slightly, her hand tightening around the honey jar as though it might serve as some small measure of protection, and fixed her eyes on the distant lights of Beatrice's house, still frustratingly far ahead through the darkening trees. The footsteps behind her quickened as well. Cordelia's heart hammered against her ribs, and every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, propriety and composure forgotten entirely in the face of real, immediate danger. She broke into a run just as a hand closed around her arm from behind, rough and strong, pulling her backward off the path and into the deeper shadow of the trees. She opened her mouth to scream, but a second hand clamped over it before any sound could escape, and she found herself staring up into the face of a man she did not recognize, his features hard and unfamiliar in the fading light, his eyes cold with a purpose she did not need explained to understand. "Quiet now," he murmured, his grip tightening on her arm. "This need not be difficult, if you cooperate." She did not cooperate. She twisted hard against his grip, driving her elbow back into his ribs with all the force panic could summon. And though the blow did little more than startle him, it was enough to loosen his hold for the single, crucial moment she needed. She tore free, stumbling forward through the underbrush, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she scrambled back toward the path, toward the distant lights that suddenly felt impossibly far away. The man cursed behind her and gave chase, his longer stride closing the distance far faster than she could hope to outrun on the uneven ground, and Cordelia understood, with a clarity born of pure terror, that she would not reach the house before he caught her again. It was the sound of hoofbeats, sudden and thunderous on the lane ahead, that changed everything. Alistair had been riding back from a meeting with Corbin at the newly acquired estate, when a strange, urgent instinct, one he would later be unable to fully explain even to himself, made him turn his horse toward the wooded path rather than the main road he had originally intended. He heard the commotion before he saw it, a woman's ragged breathing, the crash of someone moving fast and clumsy through underbrush, and he did not hesitate before spurring his horse directly into the trees. He reached the scene just as the man caught hold of Cordelia's sleeve again, and Alistair was off his horse and moving before the animal had fully stopped, closing the distance in 3 long strides and driving his shoulder into the stranger's chest with enough force to send him sprawling backward into the dirt. Cordelia. His hands found her shoulders, steadying her, as her knees threatened to give way beneath the sudden release of terror. "Are you harmed?" "I am well," she managed, though her voice shook badly enough to betray the lie in part. He came from behind, on the path. I did not see his face until he had already taken hold of me. Behind them, the stranger had scrambled back to his feet, clearly weighing the odds of continuing his attack against a duke now standing between him and his target, and clearly finding those odds unfavorable. He turned and fled deeper into the trees before Alistair could close the distance again, disappearing into the darkness with the speed of a man who knew the woods well enough to use them for escape. Alistair did not pursue him. His priority, entirely and without question, was the trembling woman still gripping his arm as though she feared her legs might not hold her otherwise. "I have you," he said quietly, guiding her toward a fallen log at the edge of the path and easing her down onto it. "You are safe now. He is gone." He said this need not be difficult if I cooperated. Her voice was steadier now, though anger had begun to creep in alongside the fading fear, as though I were meant to simply allow myself to be taken somewhere, without question, without resistance. Alistair's expression darkened considerably. "Caro grows bolder than I anticipated. I did not believe he would move against you so directly, not this soon, not with so little concealment." He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his own, and she did not pull away. "I should have insisted on an escort for you from the moment I arrived. This is my failure, not yours." "It is Caro's failure," Cordelia corrected firmly, some of her old resolve returning now that the immediate danger had passed. "You did not send that man into these woods. You did not decide that ruining my reputation was an acceptable price for protecting your own inheritance. Do not take on guilt that belongs entirely to him." He studied her for a long moment in the fading light, something in his expression shifting into an emotion she had not seen from him before, raw and unguarded in a way his careful, controlled composure rarely allowed. "You are remarkable, Cordelia Ashworth. Do you know that? Most women, after an attack such as this, would be entirely consumed by fear. You are already thinking of fairness, of placing blame correctly, of refusing to accept guilt that is not yours to carry." "I have had a great deal of practice this past fortnight," she said, a small, tired smile finally breaking through her lingering fear, "in refusing to accept blame that belongs to someone else." He laughed, quiet and genuine, and for a moment the danger of the evening seemed to recede, replaced by something warmer passing between them in the dim, quiet woods. But the moment could not last, not with a threat still very much alive and now proven willing to act. "I am taking you back to the house myself," he said, helping her to her feet, "and I intend to speak with Beatrice tonight, about additional precautions. This cannot happen again." Cordelia did not argue. The fear that had driven her through the trees moments before had not fully faded, and she found she did not object at all to the steady, protective presence of the man walking beside her, his hand resting lightly against her back as though he could not quite make himself release the last of his own fear either. They walked the remaining distance to Beatrice's house together, mostly in silence, the horse trailing quietly behind them, and it was only as the warm lights of the house came into view that Cordelia allowed herself to fully exhale, the tension of the evening finally beginning to loosen its grip on her chest. Beatrice took the news of the attack with far less shock than Cordelia expected, though considerably more anger. "I knew that stranger in the square meant no good," she said, pacing the length of her small parlor, while Marjorie fussed over a cup of hot tea Cordelia had no real interest in drinking. "I should have trusted my instincts and sent word to the constable the very first time he was noticed. The constable would have found little cause to act on a man merely standing in a square," Alistair said, seated across from Cordelia with an expression that had not fully softened since the woods. "Caro's men are careful. They do nothing that cannot be explained away as innocent, at least until they believe the moment is right to act more directly. And now they have acted," Beatrice said grimly. "What is to stop them from trying again?" It was a question none of them could answer with any real confidence, and the uncomfortable silence that followed said more than words might have. Alistair arranged for two of Corbin's men to take up quiet positions near Beatrice's house that very night, one watching the front approach and another the rear garden, and he did not leave until he had personally satisfied himself that every door and window in the house was properly secured. Cordelia found herself oddly comforted by his thoroughness, though she said nothing of it aloud, unwilling to examine too closely why his careful attention to her safety affected her so deeply. She did not sleep well that night, starting awake twice at ordinary house sounds that her frightened mind transformed into something far more sinister, and by morning she rose feeling as though she had not rested at all. It was Marjorie who discovered the letter, tucked beneath the kitchen door sometime in the early hours before dawn, left by someone who had clearly known enough to avoid the watchful eyes Alistair had posted at the front and rear of the property, slipping in instead through the narrow side path that ran along the kitchen garden. "This was not here when I banked the fire last night," Marjorie said, holding the folded paper as though it might burn her fingers, And I certainly did not put it there myself. Cordelia's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it, and the message inside, written in a plain, careful hand that revealed nothing of its author's identity, was short enough to read in a single breath. You know what you should not know. Leave Thornfield Hollow and speak of it to no one, and you will be troubled no further. Remain, or repeat what you overheard, and the next visit will not end as gently as the last. She read it twice, then a third time, feeling the cold weight of each word settle deeper into her chest with every repetition. They know I understand the danger has nothing to do with my reputation, she said quietly, handing the letter to Beatrice. This was never truly about a scandal at all. It was only ever about silencing what I overheard in my uncle's study. Word reached Alistair within the hour, carried by one of Corbyn's men on horseback, and he arrived at Beatrice's house looking as though he had dressed in considerable haste, his usual careful composure noticeably strained. "Show me," he said, and Cordelia handed him the letter without comment, watching his expression darken further with each line. "This is not the work of a hired man acting alone," he said finally. "This is calculated, deliberate, meant to frighten you into silence without risking another direct confrontation that might draw more attention to Caro's involvement. He is growing careful now that his first attempt failed." "Or growing desperate," Cordelia countered. "A careful man does not send threatening letters through a kitchen door in the middle of the night. A desperate one does, when he believes his usual methods are no longer sufficient to control the situation." Alistair considered this for a long moment, turning the letter over in his hands as though the paper itself might reveal something more about the man who had written it. Desperate men are more dangerous, not less. They take risks a careful man would never consider, precisely because they feel their options narrowing. "Then what do you propose we do?" Beatrice asked, her earlier anger having settled into something more focused and practical. "We cannot simply wait here, hoping Corbyn's men are enough to stop whatever Caro attempts next." "No," Alistair agreed. "We cannot." He was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing something carefully before he spoke again. "I believe it is time we stopped reacting to Caro's moves and began forcing him to react to ours instead. If he believes Cordelia remains the only witness to his original scheme, he will continue targeting her until either he succeeds or he is stopped entirely. But if we can draw him into revealing himself directly, in a manner that leaves no question of his guilt, we remove his advantage entirely." "You mean to use me as bait," Cordelia said flatly. "I mean to give you a choice in the matter, which is more than Caro has offered you thus far." Alistair met her eyes steadily. "I will not pretend the plan carries no risk, but continuing as we are, waiting for his next attempt without any means of anticipating it, carries risk of its own, and I trust you enough, Cordelia, to let you decide which risk you are willing to accept." She appreciated, more than she could easily express, that he had not simply decided on her behalf, the way her own family had decided her fate without consulting her wishes at all. "Tell me the plan," she said, "all of it, and then I will decide." Over the following hour, Alistair laid out his thinking carefully. Corbyn had already begun quietly investigating Caro's recent movements and finances, searching for any evidence connecting him directly to the missing stable hand or the original plot against Alistair's life. If they could arrange circumstances that forced Caro to act more openly, perhaps by allowing word to spread, carefully and through controlled channels, that Cordelia intended to return to London and share what she had overheard with the proper authorities, Caro might be pressed into a mistake that would expose him beyond any doubt. "It is dangerous," Alistair admitted. "If he believes you pose an immediate threat to expose him, he may act more aggressively than the letter suggests he is currently willing to risk. But if it works," Cordelia said slowly, "it ends this. Properly. Not with me hiding in Yorkshire indefinitely, waiting for a threat that never fully resolves itself." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the threatening letter still resting on the table between them, thinking of her family's panic, her brother's inability to look at her, the entire weight of a scandal she had never deserved. She had spent the past weeks being acted upon, sent away, threatened, chased through darkened woods, always reacting to danger rather than confronting it directly. "I want to help end this," she said finally, lifting her chin with a resolve that seemed to settle something in Alistair's expression, something close to admiration. "Tell me exactly what you need me to do." The plan they settled on over the following days was careful and deliberate. Word would be allowed to spread, through a trusted contact of Corbyn's who moved in circles close enough to Caro's household to be believable, that Lady Ashworth intended to travel to London within the fortnight to speak with a magistrate about matters concerning the Duke of Jedburgh's safety. It was, in truth, entirely accurate, though the timing and manner of her supposed return would be arranged to draw Caro's attention at a moment and place of their own choosing, rather than his. Corbin arrived from London midway through that week, bringing news that hardened Alistair's resolve considerably. He had located a groom, previously in Caro's employ, who had been dismissed abruptly and without proper wages some months before, and who, once assured his safety would be protected, admitted to overhearing Caro speak with an unfamiliar visitor about a debt that needed settling before the season's end. The groom could not say with certainty what the debt concerned, but the timing aligned closely enough with the original plot against Alistair's life that Corbin considered it far more than mere coincidence. "He is spending beyond his means," Corbin reported, laying out a small stack of notes he had gathered from moneylenders willing to speak, quietly, for the right price. Gambling debts, mostly, accumulated over the better part of 2 years. He has borrowed heavily against an inheritance he does not yet possess, and I suspect his creditors have grown considerably less patient in recent months. "Which gives him every reason to want me dead sooner rather than later," Alistair said grimly, "and every reason to silence anyone who might expose the scheme before it can be completed." "It also gives us leverage," Cordelia pointed out. "A desperate man drowning in debt is far easier to draw into a mistake than a patient one, with nothing pressing against him." Alistair looked at her with something close to pride. "You have a sharper mind for this than half the men Corbin has worked alongside over the years. I have simply had a great deal of time to think, these past weeks, about how badly I wish to see this resolved properly." In the meantime, Alistair remained close, splitting his days between his newly acquired estate and Beatrice's house, and Cordelia found herself growing accustomed to his presence in a way that surprised her with how quickly it had happened. He was not, she discovered, the composed, distant figure society painted him as. He laughed easily when Beatrice teased him about his unfamiliarity with sheep farming. He listened, genuinely and attentively, when Cordelia spoke of her frustrations with a world that valued appearance over truth. And more than once she caught him watching her with an expression that had nothing at all to do with duty or protection. An expression that made her pulse quicken in a way she had not experienced with any of the suitable young men her mother had once paraded before her in London. It was on a quiet evening, walking the same lane where she had been attacked days before, now flanked discreetly by 2 of Corbin's men keeping careful distance, that Alistair finally said aloud what had clearly been building between them for days. "I find myself in an unusual position, Cordelia," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I came to Yorkshire to protect a woman who had risked her own safety for mine, out of duty and gratitude, nothing more complicated than that. I did not expect to find myself thinking of her constantly, worrying for her safety in ways that extend far beyond simple duty, wanting nothing more than to see her smile at the end of each difficult day." Cordelia's breath caught, though she kept her eyes fixed on the darkening path ahead, unwilling to let him see how deeply his words had affected her. "Your Grace." "Alistair," he corrected gently. "Please, we have moved well beyond formal titles, I think, given everything we have faced together these past weeks." "Alistair," she allowed herself, finally, to look at him, and found his expression open and unguarded, in a way she had rarely seen from him before. "I did not expect this either. I came here expecting only exile, punishment for a kindness the world decided to misunderstand. I did not expect to find myself caring for the very man whose life I risked everything to save." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully, and for a moment the danger surrounding them, Caro's letter, the attack in the woods, the careful plan they had constructed to draw a desperate man into exposing himself, all of it seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant beside the quiet, charged space between them. "When this is over," he said softly, "when Caro has been stopped and your name has been properly cleared, I intend to ask you a question I have been thinking of since that very first night on my terrace. I will not ask it now, not while danger still hangs over us both, because you deserve an answer given freely, without the shadow of fear influencing your response in any way." "And if I already know what my answer would be?" she asked quietly. Something warm and hopeful flickered across his features. "Then I hope you will find the patience to wait a little longer, so that when I finally ask, we may both answer with nothing standing between us but the truth of what we feel." She did not argue further, though the walk back to Beatrice's house that evening felt different somehow, lighter despite the danger still surrounding them both, carried forward by the quiet promise of what waited for them once Caro's scheme had finally been brought fully into the light. That night, lying awake long after the house had gone quiet, Cordelia found herself thinking not of fear, nor of Caro's letter still folded away in a drawer downstairs, but of the way Alistair's voice had softened when he spoke of the question he intended to ask her. She thought of her mother's panic the night the scandal broke, of her brother's inability to meet her eyes, of an entire city that had judged her guilty on nothing more than a rumor cleverly placed. None of it, she realized, mattered nearly so much now as it once had. Whatever came next, whatever risk the coming days required of her, she found she was no longer afraid of facing it, so long as she did not have to face it alone. The trap, when it finally closed, did not unfold the way any of them had carefully planned. Word of Cordelia's supposed return to London had spread precisely as intended, carried through Corbyn's trusted contact into circles close enough to Edmund Carow that Alistair felt reasonably confident the message had reached its target within days. The plan called for patience, for watching quietly as Carow revealed his next move on ground and timing of their own choosing, giving Corbyn's men every advantage in catching him with evidence too clear to deny. Carow, it turned out, had no intention of waiting for their chosen moment. He arrived at Thornfield Hollow himself, 3 days earlier than anyone had anticipated, arriving not under cover of darkness or careful disguise but in broad daylight, riding directly into the village square in a fine carriage that immediately drew the attention of every villager present. He was, Cordelia realized the moment she saw him step down from the carriage, a man who had decided that subtlety no longer served his purposes, and had chosen instead to gamble everything on a single, bold confrontation. Lady Ashworth. His voice carried easily across the square, pleasant and composed in a way that made her skin crawl, given everything she now knew of him. How fortunate to find you still in the countryside. I had heard rumors of your imminent return to London, and hoped to have a word with you before you departed. Cordelia had been walking to market with Marjorie when Carow arrived, and she felt the older woman's hand tighten protectively on her arm as the carriage door closed behind him. Several villagers had paused their own business to watch the exchange, sensing, perhaps, that something significant was unfolding in their quiet square. Lord Carow. She kept her voice carefully even, though her heart had begun hammering against her ribs. I confess I am surprised to see you so far from London. Family business, he said smoothly, echoing almost exactly the excuse Alistair had once offered her. My cousin, the Duke, has been rather difficult to locate in recent weeks. I understand he has taken a sudden interest in Yorkshire property. Curious timing, given your own presence here. I could not say what draws His Grace's interest to any particular property, Cordelia replied, refusing to let her expression betray anything at all. Carow smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. Of course not. Forgive me, my lady. I had merely hoped, given the unfortunate rumors surrounding your recent indiscretion, that you might be persuaded to consider carefully what further conversations you intend to have upon your return to the city. Certain accusations, however well-intentioned, have a way of causing a great deal of damage to those who make them, and to those they concern. It was, Cordelia understood immediately, as direct a threat as he dared make in public, wrapped carefully enough in polite phrasing that any listener would hear only concerned advice rather than intimidation. She felt anger rise sharp and hot beneath her carefully controlled composure. I have found, she said, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her, that the truth, however damaging to certain parties, tends to matter a great deal more than the comfort of those it inconveniences. Something flickered across Carow's face, quick and dangerous, before his pleasant mask settled back into place. A bold philosophy, my lady. I hope it continues to serve you well. He inclined his head slightly, the gesture somehow managing to feel more like a warning than a courtesy. I shall not keep you from your errands further. Good day. He returned to his carriage and departed the square as quickly as he had arrived, leaving Cordelia standing rigid with anger and fear in equal measure, Marjorie's hand still tight around her arm. The villagers who had witnessed the exchange did not return immediately to their business. A small cluster gathered near the well, murmuring amongst themselves, and Cordelia caught fragments of their conversation as she and Marjorie finally continued toward the market stalls. They had understood, even without knowing the full particulars, that something dangerous had passed through their quiet square, and more than one curious glance followed Cordelia the rest of that morning, though none of it carried the cruel judgment she had grown accustomed to in London drawing rooms. Here, the concern in their eyes looked more like worry for her safety than eagerness for scandal, and she found herself grateful, even amid her fear, for the particular kindness of a community that had never once made her feel like an outsider. That man means you harm, Marjorie said quietly, once the carriage had disappeared down the road. I have seen enough travelers pass through this village to know a threat dressed in fine clothing when I see one. Cordelia sent word to Alistair immediately, and he arrived at Beatrice's house within the hour, his expression darkening considerably as she recounted the exchange in the village square. "He is unraveling," Alistair said, pacing the length of the small parlor with barely contained anger. "A patient man does not travel to a small Yorkshire village to threaten a witness in public, in front of an entire village of potential observers. He has grown reckless, which means his debts or his fear of exposure have finally outpaced his ability to think clearly. Or it means he intends to move against us more directly, very soon," Corbin added grimly from where he stood near the window, watching the road outside. "A man who no longer cares about subtlety is a man who believes he has run out of time for careful planning." "Then we must be ready before he decides what that plan will be," Alistair said, already moving toward the door to speak with the men he had positioned around the property. "Corbin, double the watch tonight. I do not intend to leave anything to chance, not after what we witnessed in that square today." Cordelia spent the remainder of the afternoon trying, without much success, to occupy herself with ordinary tasks, folding linens and helping Marjorie prepare the evening meal, though her hands moved without any real attention behind them. Every sound from outside the house drew her eyes toward the window. Every shift in the evening light made her pulse quicken with a fear she could not quite shake, no matter how firmly she reminded herself that Corbin's men stood watch just beyond the garden wall. The warning proved prophetic within a matter of hours. It was well past dark when the fire began, catching first in the small barn behind Beatrice's house where the sheep sheltered overnight, the flames visible through Cordelia's bedroom window before anyone in the house had fully understood what was happening. She woke to the sound of Marjorie's frantic shouting and the sharp, acrid smell of smoke already curling beneath her door. "Fire!" Marjorie's voice carried through the house, sharp with panic. "The barn is burning. Everyone out, quickly now." Cordelia scrambled from her bed and into the hall, finding Beatrice already directing the household's small staff toward the well with buckets while Marjorie herded the last of the sheep from the burning structure, their frightened bleating carrying sharply through the smoke-filled night air. It was Corbin, stationed nearby as he had been every night since the attack in the woods, who first noticed the figure moving away from the scene rather than toward it, slipping through the shadows at the edge of the property, while everyone else's attention remained fixed on the flames. "There," he called sharply to the men positioned with him, already breaking into a run toward the fleeing figure. "That man there, by the eastern hedge." The chase that followed was brief, but decisive. Corbin's men, having anticipated exactly this kind of desperate action from Caro's growing recklessness, had positioned themselves carefully enough around the property's edges that the fleeing figure found every direction blocked within a matter of minutes. He was captured near the boundary wall, still smelling faintly of oil and smoke, and dragged back toward the house, struggling and cursing every step of the way. Alistair arrived within the half hour, summoned urgently by one of Corbin's men, and found the barn largely saved, thanks to the household's quick action with buckets from the well, though the structure itself would need considerable repair. More importantly, he found the captured man seated under guard in Beatrice's kitchen, sullen and silent despite Corbin's careful questioning. "He will not speak," Corbin said quietly, drawing Alistair aside. "Not yet, but we found this on him." He held out a small leather purse, considerably heavier than its size suggested, along with a folded note bearing instructions written in a hand Alistair recognized immediately from the earlier threatening letter left at Beatrice's kitchen door. "Caro's hand," Alistair said grimly, reading the note's brief, damning instructions. "Burn the barn, frighten them into silence, or worse if the opportunity presents itself. Payment upon confirmation. This is more than enough to prove his direct involvement, provided the man in your custody is willing to confirm it before a magistrate." "He may need considerable persuasion," Corbin admitted. "Men in Caro's employ tend to fear him more immediately than they fear the law, at least until they understand precisely how much trouble they themselves now face." It took the better part of that night and the following morning, but persuasion, in the form of a clear explanation regarding the difference between a lesser charge for a hired hand who cooperated and a far graver charge for one who did not, eventually loosened the captured man's tongue considerably. He confirmed, in a signed statement witnessed by both Corbin and the local magistrate summoned urgently from a neighboring town, that he had been hired directly by Lord Edmund Caro to frighten Lady Ashworth into silence, first through the threatening letter, and now through more direct and dangerous means, with explicit instruction that greater harm was acceptable should intimidation alone prove insufficient. It was not, on its own, absolute proof of the original plot against Alistair's life, but combined with the evidence Corbin had already gathered concerning Caro's crushing debts and his footman's role in spreading the original scandal, it formed a case substantial enough that the magistrate agreed, without much hesitation, to issue a warrant for Caro's immediate arrest. Caro was found at the inn where he had taken rooms upon his arrival in the area, apparently confident enough in his hired man's discretion that he had not troubled himself to flee the moment the fire failed to achieve its intended purpose. He did not go quietly. When the magistrate's men arrived to execute the warrant, he attempted first to bluster his way past them with threats of his own considerable influence, and when that failed, attempted a clumsy escape through the inn's rear entrance, only to find Alistair himself waiting there, having anticipated exactly such an attempt. "It is finished, Edmund." Alistair's voice was cold and controlled in a way Cordelia, watching from a careful distance alongside Beatrice, had never heard from him before. "Your man has confirmed everything. The fire, the threats, and I suspect once Corbin finishes tracing your finances properly, the original plot against my life as well." Caro's composure finally shattered entirely, his carefully maintained pleasant mask dissolving into something desperate and ugly. "You do not understand what it is to watch everything you deserve, handed instead to a cousin who never once had to work for any of it. I have spent years watching you inherit title, wealth, respect, all of it simply because you were born a few years before me, and to the correct branch of the family. I deserved better than the scraps left to me. You deserved nothing you were not willing to earn honestly," Alistair replied, his voice hard. "And instead of earning anything, you chose to ruin an innocent woman's reputation, hire men to threaten her life, and very nearly succeed in taking mine, all to satisfy debts of your own reckless making. Whatever sympathy your circumstances might once have earned, you have long since forfeited it entirely." Caro was taken into custody without further resistance, his shoulders slumping with the particular defeat of a man who understood, finally, that every careful scheme had unraveled completely, leaving him with nothing left to bargain with at all. Word of Caro's arrest spread through Thornfield Hollow with the particular speed only a small village could manage, and by the time the magistrate's men had escorted him away toward the county jail, half the village had gathered near the inn to witness the end of the affair for themselves. Cordelia heard, more than once in the murmuring crowd, her own name spoken not with the sharp, cruel edge she had grown accustomed to in London, but with something closer to sympathy and quiet admiration, villagers who had watched her these past weeks, and drawn their own conclusions about her character, entirely separate from whatever rumors had once chased her north. Cordelia watched the entire confrontation from a distance, Beatrice's steady presence beside her, and felt something long, coiled tight in her chest finally begin to loosen. It was over. The threat that had followed her from a London ballroom to a quiet Yorkshire village, the scandal that had cost her family, friends, and reputation alike, had finally been exposed for exactly what it was, the desperate scheme of a jealous, indebted man, rather than any true failing of her own character. Alistair crossed the inn yard to join her once Caro had been led away, his expression easing from cold fury into something far warmer as he took in the sight of her, safe and unharmed despite the danger of the past hours. "It is done," he said quietly. "Corbin will see the full case properly documented, and I intend to ensure the magistrate understands precisely how thoroughly your name deserves to be cleared once the truth of Caro's scheme becomes public. No one who hears the whole account will doubt, for even a moment, that you acted with nothing but courage and kindness that night in my study. And you, your grace?" A small, tired smile finally found its way to her lips. "What becomes of you now, with your inheritance secure and your cousin's ambitions properly ended?" He reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his own, and the tenderness of the gesture, after so many days of fear and careful strategy, nearly undid the last of her composure entirely. "Now," he said softly, "I believe I owe you a question I promised to ask once the danger had passed, and I find I am no longer willing to wait even a single day longer to ask it." Cordelia did not answer him immediately, though not from any hesitation. The weight of everything that had happened over the past weeks, the scandal, the exile, the fear, the danger, seemed to press against her all at once, and she found herself needing a single steadying breath before she could trust her own voice. "Ask me properly then," she said finally, a small smile breaking through despite everything. "And not standing in an inn yard with a magistrate's men still leading your cousin away in chains." Alistair laughed, low and warm, and something in the sound eased the last of the tension still gripping her chest. "Fair enough. You deserve better than an inn yard, certainly." He glanced around at the gathered villagers, still murmuring amongst themselves about the morning's dramatic events, and then back to her with a look that made her pulse quicken all over again. "Walk with me?" They made their way slowly back toward Beatrice's house, the late afternoon light softening the fields around them into gold, and neither of them spoke for a long while, content simply to walk together without the weight of danger pressing at their backs for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. It was in the same quiet lane where he had once told her he could not forget where she had gone, where he had pulled her from a stranger's grip only days before, that Alistair finally stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Cordelia Ashworth," he said, his voice steady despite the visible emotion beneath it. "I came to Yorkshire believing I owed you a debt of protection, nothing more complicated than duty and gratitude. I did not expect to find, in the middle of fear and danger and careful strategy, that I had also found the one woman whose company I could not imagine living without. You risked everything for a stranger's life, expecting nothing in return, and I find I would like very much to spend the rest of my own life ensuring you never again suffer for an act of pure courage and kindness." He drew a small ring from his coat pocket, simple and elegant, entirely unlike the ostentatious jewelry so common among London's fashionable circles. "Will you marry me?" Tears she had refused to allow herself throughout the entire ordeal finally slipped free, though these carried nothing of sorrow in them at all. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper before strengthening into certainty. "Yes, Alistair. 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly despite his careful composure, and when he finally drew her close, the kiss that followed carried within it every ounce of fear, relief, and quiet devotion that had built between them across the long, dangerous weeks since a ballroom's cruel whisper had first sent her fleeing north. News of Caro's arrest and full confession reached London within the week, carried swiftly by the same efficient network of gossip that had once destroyed Cordelia's reputation so thoroughly, though this time the story that spread was entirely, undeniably true. Caro's confession, given in exchange for a lesser sentence, laid out every detail of his scheme in damning clarity. His crushing gambling debts, his resentment toward a cousin who possessed everything he believed himself entitled to, his decision to eliminate Alistair through a forged plot involving the missing stable hand, and, when that failed thanks to Cordelia's timely warning, his calculated choice to destroy her reputation instead, ensuring her warning would be dismissed as scandal rather than truth, while simultaneously distracting Alistair from investigating too closely. The very society that had turned on Cordelia so swiftly and so completely now scrambled, with equal speed, to reverse its judgment entirely. The Countess of Marrow, whose painted fan had carried the first cruel whispers through that fateful ballroom, was reportedly among the first to declare, loudly, and to anyone who would listen, that she had never truly believed the rumors herself, a claim so transparently false that even her closest friends struggled to keep straight faces upon hearing it. Cordelia's family received the news with a mixture of relief and shame that her mother, at least, made no attempt to hide when she arrived in Yorkshire herself, traveling north the moment word of Caro's confession reached London, unable to wait for her daughter's eventual return. "I should have trusted you," her mother said, standing in Beatrice's small parlor with an expression far more humbled than Cordelia had ever seen from her. "I should have believed you when you told me the truth of what happened that night, rather than allowing fear of scandal to override my faith in my own daughter's character." "You believed what the entire world seemed determined to believe," Cordelia said, though there was no real bitterness left in the words, only the quiet peace of a wound finally allowed to heal properly. "I cannot fault you entirely for that, though I will admit it was a difficult thing to bear, being sent away for a crime I never committed." "No," her mother agreed softly. "It was not fair to you, and I intend to spend a great deal of effort ensuring London understands exactly how unfair it was once you return." Before returning to London herself, Cordelia insisted on one final matter being properly settled. She asked Alistair to arrange a visit to the county jail where Caro awaited transfer to face the full weight of the charges against him, a request that surprised him considerably. "I do not understand what you hope to gain from seeing him again," Alistair said, though he did not refuse her. "He has done nothing but harm you since the moment his footman first spoke that rumor in a crowded ballroom." "I do not wish to see him for his benefit," Cordelia said. "I wish to see him for my own. I have spent weeks being afraid of a man I barely understood, reacting to threats and danger without ever truly confronting the person behind them. I find I would like to look him in the eye, once, and let him see plainly that he did not succeed in breaking me, whatever he intended." Caro, when they visited him briefly under careful guard, looked considerably smaller than he had during his confrontation at the inn, stripped now of fine clothing and confident bluster alike, reduced to a plain prisoner awaiting judgment. He said little, offering neither apology nor further justification for his actions, though something in his expression, when he finally met Cordelia's steady gaze, suggested he understood at last the full scope of what his jealousy and desperation had cost him. "I hope," Cordelia said quietly, before they left him to whatever fate the courts would decide, that you eventually find some way to make peace with the choices you made, Lord Caro, not for my sake, or for Alistair's, for your own. She did not wait for a response, turning instead and walking out of the gale with her head held high, feeling, for the first time since that fateful ballroom, entirely and completely free of the fear that had followed her these past difficult weeks. Cordelia's engagement to the Duke of Jedburgh, announced formally within days of her mother's arrival in Yorkshire, only added further fuel to society's rapid reversal of opinion. A duke did not offer marriage to a woman he believed guilty of impropriety, and the fact that Alistair had personally traveled to Yorkshire, uncovered his own cousin's treachery, and risked his own safety to protect her, transformed Cordelia's story in the public imagination, from scandalous cautionary tale into something closer to a romantic legend, the kind whispered about with admiration rather than judgment. Their return to London, several weeks later, bore almost no resemblance to the humiliating departure that had sent Cordelia north in disgrace. She entered the very same ballroom where the scandal had first broken, now on Alistair's arm, wearing a gown of deep blue silk that Marjorie herself had insisted upon before their departure from Yorkshire, declaring plain wool entirely unsuitable for a duchess's triumphant return. The room fell silent as they entered, though this silence carried nothing of the cruel anticipation that had once accompanied whispers about her. Instead, one by one, the very same guests who had once turned away from her in judgment now approached with careful, apologetic warmth, eager to offer congratulations on her engagement and, more quietly, expressions of regret for having believed the worst of her so quickly. The Countess of Marrow herself approached near the evening's end, her painted fan absent for once, her expression carefully composed into something resembling genuine contrition. Lady Ashworth, I understand congratulations are in order. I do hope you know I never truly believed. I know precisely what you believe, Countess, Cordelia interrupted, her voice pleasant but firm, carrying none of the anger she might once have felt entitled to, only a quiet, unshakable confidence that no rumor could ever touch again. But I find I hold no interest in revisiting old whispers tonight. I would much rather enjoy my evening. The Countess, clearly unaccustomed to being so gracefully dismissed, offered a stiff nod and retreated into the crowd, and Alistair, standing beside Cordelia with poorly concealed amusement, leaned close enough to murmur softly in her ear. Remarkably diplomatic, given how thoroughly that woman ruined your season. I have decided, Cordelia said, a small, satisfied smile playing at her lips, that I would rather spend my energy building the life I actually want, rather than dwelling on the people who once tried to take it from me. In the months that followed their return to London, Cordelia found herself navigating society with a confidence she had never possessed before her exile to Yorkshire. Invitations that had once been quietly withdrawn now arrived in greater numbers than she could reasonably accept, though she found herself accepting only those extended by people whose warmth felt genuine, rather than driven by simple curiosity about a duke's remarkable bride. Her closest friend from before the scandal, the one who had found convenient reasons to stop calling once the rumors spread, attempted several times to renew their acquaintance, and Cordelia, after some consideration, decided to extend the same grace to her that she had offered her own brother, understanding that fear made people behave in ways they might later regret, without excusing the hurt those choices had caused along the way. Nathaniel Corbin remained in Alistair's employ, and became, over the following months, something closer to a trusted friend than a mere servant of the household, a transition Cordelia watched unfold with quiet satisfaction, knowing how much the man's careful, thorough work had contributed to her own safety and eventual vindication. When Alistair offered him a permanent position managing the Yorkshire estate, now formally settled as part of the family's holdings, Corbin accepted without hesitation, admitting he had grown rather fond of the quiet northern countryside during the weeks he had spent protecting Cordelia there. They were married the following spring, in a ceremony far smaller and quieter than London society expected of a duke's wedding, held instead at Alistair's country estate near Thornfield Hollow, with Beatrice and Marjorie seated proudly among the guests alongside villagers who had welcomed Cordelia so warmly during the difficult weeks of her exile. Her family attended in full, her mother weeping openly throughout the ceremony, her brother finally offering the apology he had been too ashamed to give in the immediate aftermath of the scandal. I should have stood beside you that night, Edwin told her quietly, before the ceremony began, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Instead of rushing you away, as though you were the one who had done something wrong. You were frightened for me, in your own way, Cordelia said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant the forgiveness in her words entirely. We have all learned a great deal this past year about the difference between fear and true loyalty. I would rather remember that lesson than hold on to old resentment. The ceremony itself was simple, exactly as Cordelia had wished it to be, conducted in the small stone chapel at the edge of the estate rather than any grand cathedral London might have expected of a duke's wedding. She wore a gown far plainer than fashion demanded, insisting she wanted to be married as the woman Yorkshire had shaped her into, not the carefully polished creature London society had once tried to make of her. Beatrice cried through most of the vows, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and muttering something about ruining a perfectly good morning with sentiment, while Marjorie beamed with unrestrained pride from her seat near the front, having personally overseen every detail of the modest wedding breakfast that followed. When Alistair slid a second ring onto her finger, this one plainer and more permanent than the engagement ring that had first marked their promise to each other, Cordelia felt none of the fear that had once defined her final weeks in London, only a deep, settled certainty that she had found, in the unlikeliest of circumstances, exactly where she was meant to belong. As the ceremony concluded and the small gathering moved outside into the warm spring afternoon, Cordelia found herself standing beside Alistair on the very terrace where their story had first truly begun, though transformed now beyond recognition from that cold, frightened night months before. The garden below bloomed fully with early summer flowers, and the quiet Yorkshire hills stretched out beyond the estate's boundaries, peaceful and unthreatening in a way they had not always felt during those anxious weeks of danger and careful strategy. "Do you remember," Alistair said softly, drawing her close against the light spring breeze, "standing on my London terrace, telling me you were being sent away to forget I existed?" "I remember," Cordelia said, leaning into him with the easy comfort of someone who no longer feared what the future might hold. "I also remember telling myself, quite firmly, that your promise not to forget me meant nothing at all. And yet here we are." "Here we are," she agreed, tilting her face up to meet his smile with her own. "Proof, I suppose, that some promises are worth believing after all, even when the whole world insists you should not." 3 years passed, and the story of Cordelia and Alistair Vane became, in the way certain stories eventually do, something closer to legend than memory, told and retold at dinner parties by people who had never actually witnessed the events themselves, growing more dramatic with each telling, until Cordelia herself sometimes struggled to recognize the version being described. Thornfield Hollow had changed little in those years, though the villagers now spoke of Beatrice Holt's small estate with a particular pride, having watched a disgraced young woman arrive among them in quiet exile and depart, eventually, as a duchess who never once forgot the community that had welcomed her so warmly during her most difficult weeks. Cordelia and Alistair returned each summer without fail, splitting their year evenly between the grand responsibilities of London society and the quiet, unhurried peace of the Yorkshire countryside that had first brought them together under such dangerous circumstances. Marjorie, now well into her later years, had flatly refused every attempt to retire her from Beatrice's household, declaring she intended to keep working until her hands simply would not allow it any longer, though she had grudgingly accepted help from a younger girl in the village who reminded her, she claimed, of a headstrong young woman who had once arrived from London knowing nothing whatsoever about hedges or henhouses. "You've grown into someone entirely different than the girl who first walked through that gate," Marjorie told Cordelia during one such summer visit, watching from the kitchen window as Cordelia chased her young daughter across the garden, both of them laughing too hard to catch their breath properly. "Though I suppose I always knew you had it in you, even that first difficult week, when you kept insisting you weren't afraid of hedges despite the scratches all up your arms proving otherwise." Cordelia laughed at the memory, scooping her daughter up as the little girl finally caught her, both of them breathless and thoroughly disheveled. Their daughter, named Beatrice after the cousin who had taken in a frightened, disgraced young woman without hesitation and given her a place to rebuild her life from nothing, had inherited her father's dark hair and her mother's stubborn determination in equal measure, a combination that already, at 3 years old, promised considerable trouble for anyone foolish enough to underestimate her. "Mama again," young Beatrice demanded, wriggling free and darting off across the garden once more, and Cordelia glanced toward the terrace where Alistair stood, watching them both with the same warm, unguarded expression he had worn on their wedding day, an expression that had never once dimmed in the years since. Their life together had not been without its ordinary difficulties, the small disagreements and adjustments any marriage required, but the deep, steady partnership forged in danger and honesty during those frightening Yorkshire weeks had proven remarkably resilient against the smaller storms of everyday life. Alistair had thrown himself into estate matters with renewed purpose once Caro's threat had been fully resolved, using his position and influence to advocate, quietly but persistently, for better protections against exactly the kind of predatory scheming that had nearly destroyed both their lives, working with fellow peers in the House of Lords to close legal loopholes that had once allowed a desperate, indebted man to nearly ruin an innocent woman's entire future, through nothing more than a carefully placed rumor. Cordelia, for her part, had found unexpected purpose in quietly supporting other young women whose reputations had suffered under similar unfair circumstances, using her own considerable social standing to counter cruel gossip whenever she encountered it, refusing to let London's rumor mill destroy another life the way it had so nearly destroyed hers. More than once, a frightened young woman arrived at their London townhouse seeking advice or simple reassurance, having heard through whispered channels that the Duchess of Jedburgh understood, better than most, exactly how quickly and unfairly a reputation could be shattered by nothing more than careless words spoken in the wrong drawing room. "You have built quite a reputation of your own," Alistair observed one evening, watching her write a careful letter of support to a young woman she had never actually met, whose situation had been described to her by a mutual acquaintance concerned for the girl's welfare. "Rather different from the reputation London first assigned you." "I find I prefer this one considerably," Cordelia replied, setting down her pen and joining him near the fire. "Though I suppose I owe a great debt to the very scandal that nearly ruined me, for teaching me exactly how much damage careless judgment can cause, and exactly how much good might come from refusing to let that judgment stand unchallenged." Edwin, her brother, had married 2 years after Cordelia's own wedding, choosing a quiet, sensible woman who bore little resemblance to the fashionable ladies their mother had once hoped he might pursue, and the two siblings had grown considerably closer in the years since the scandal, their old resentment fully healed into something steadier and more honest than their relationship had ever been before that painful ordeal. Beatrice Holt, still sharp-tongued and entirely unimpressed by titles or London fashion, had become something of a beloved fixture at family gatherings, arriving each Christmas with jars of honey from the same old widow's bees, and stories that grew only slightly more exaggerated with each retelling. She had never remarried, having buried a husband decades before Cordelia's arrival, and declared herself perfectly content managing her own small estate without further complication. But she doted on young Beatrice with a fierce, quiet devotion that reminded Cordelia often of the woman's steady, unwavering support during those frightening weeks of exile and danger. Nathaniel Corbin remained a close and trusted friend of the family, having married a young woman from the village not long after settling permanently into managing the Yorkshire estate, and his own growing family had become fast friends with Alistair and Cordelia's household. The children of both families often found tumbling together through the same gardens where their parents had once faced down considerably more dangerous circumstances. Edmund Carow served several years in prison before his eventual release, stripped entirely of any claim to the Jedburgh inheritance, and left to rebuild whatever remained of his life through his own honest effort, a fate Alistair considered, in the end, more just than any harsher punishment might have been. Cordelia rarely thought of him at all in the years that followed, the fear he had once inspired in her having faded almost entirely into distant memory, overshadowed by the far greater joy her life had become since those dangerous weeks had finally resolved themselves. Word reached them once, some years later, through a distant acquaintance, that Carow had taken up modest work as a clerk in a shipping office in Bristol, far removed from the fashionable circles he had once schemed so desperately to remain part of. Alistair read the news without any particular satisfaction or lingering anger, simply setting the letter aside and returning to the ledgers spread across his desk, and Cordelia understood, watching him, that he had truly moved past the entire affair as fully as she herself had, neither of them willing to let a man who had once tried so hard to destroy their happiness continue occupying any meaningful space in the life they had since built together. The village of Thornfield Hollow, meanwhile, had grown gently over those same years, welcoming a handful of new families drawn by the quiet reputation the estate now carried, a place where a duke and duchess treated their neighbors with genuine warmth rather than distant condescension. Young Beatrice grew up entirely comfortable moving between the grand rooms of the London townhouse and the simple stone cottages of the village, equally at ease curtsying, before visiting nobility and helping the miller's wife gather eggs, a balance her parents had worked carefully to ensure, neither wanting their daughter to forget the humble kindness that had once saved her mother's life, nor the responsibilities that came with the privileged position she had been born into. On the evening of their third wedding anniversary, Alistair and Cordelia stood once more on the terrace where their story had first begun, watching the sun set over the Yorkshire hills while young Beatrice slept soundly in the nursery upstairs, worn out from an entire afternoon spent chasing butterflies through the garden, with an energy that left both her parents thoroughly exhausted in comparison. Do you ever regret it? Alistair asked quietly, pulling her close against the cool evening air. That single choice, to walk into my study that night, warning me of danger, despite every risk it carried for your own reputation. If you had simply stayed home that evening, none of what followed would have happened at all. No scandal, no exile, no danger from Caro's schemes. Cordelia considered the question seriously, though her answer, when it came, required no real hesitation at all. I have thought of that question many times over these years, and I find my answer never changes. If staying silent that night meant staying safe, but losing you entirely, and losing everything our life together has become, then I would make the very same choice again, every single time, regardless of whatever price it demanded of me. He kissed her softly, the warm evening light settling golden around them both, and somewhere above, in the quiet nursery, their daughter slept peacefully, entirely unaware of the danger and courage that had once brought her parents together, knowing only the steady, unwavering love that continued to grow between them with each passing year. Then I suppose, Alistair murmured against her hair, we have Edmund Caro to thank, in his own strange, unintended way, for everything we have built since. Cordelia laughed softly at that, tilting her face up toward the fading light. Let us not thank him too generously. I believe I prefer to credit courage and stubbornness, and perhaps a small measure of fortunate timing, rather than the jealous scheming of a desperate man. As you wish, my love. Alistair smiled, drawing her closer still, as the last light faded gently over the hills they had both come to call home. Whatever the cause, I find myself grateful beyond words that a frightened young woman once chose courage over caution, and changed both our lives forever because of it. They remained on the terrace long after the sun had fully set, content simply to stand together in comfortable silence. Two people who had faced genuine danger and emerged from it not merely intact, but stronger and more certain of each other than either had ever imagined possible. Their story, once nearly destroyed by cruelty and rumor, now settled permanently into something far better than either of them could have dreamed during those frightening early days of scandal and exile. A quiet, lasting happiness, built on truth, courage, and the unshakable loyalty of two people who had chosen, again and again, to stand beside each other no matter what danger the world tried to place between them.